Now it has no fewer like a woman scored, and that's even more the case with a 50-foot woman. That's of course the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman iconic poster. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hi there.
And I think that's the thing. Like, have you ever kind of sometimes found some of these movie posters that are so eye-catching you feel kind of just that's almost like reason enough to watch the movie?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's probably an entire history and analysis of movie posters and which are the most successful and which aren't. I mean, I think some of the really great ones are actually I think Nosferatu had a really great poster. And yeah, there's a few others like that, and lots of Boris Karloff movies tended to have really striking posters back then. But yeah, it's kind of what I really like is these were the 80s. There was a definite period, and it's kind of pastiched on Stranger Things, where they have this sort of has all the characters of whatever whoever in the movie all kind of painted in a kind of a formation, almost like a sort of a Renaissance triptych or something like that. But it's just sort of hand painted posters from that area were really evocative. And they didn't do that at all in the 90s. They sort of seemed to completely change that style. But
right. Yeah, it's kind of funny how like there are certain periods like you mentioned that just seem to shine with like kind of the things that drew us to the theater. And I guess it's what's interesting nowadays too that with a lot of things going direct to streaming, like movie posters are becoming almost a little bit of a lost art in themselves. Yet like at different times though, like then for the Netflix thumbnail, like kind of that's almost it, like now. That's like kind of become our posters and stuff. I know for me, like certainly Star Wars, like there wasn't. I don't remember there really like a trailer for it. I mean, I know there was one, but it was word of mouth. And there's also like seeing this poster of like this kind of fantastic like space battle with kind of romantic kind of images and stuff like that. That was in itself kind of enough to make me like kind of just want to run to the theater.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. The thumbnail, and in particular, what I've noticed is with set-top boxes, when you click on something, there's a much bigger, much more sort of attention-grabbing shot. Like American Horror Story at the moment has this picture of I think a woman making out with an alien, and it's very, very kind of like you can't turn away from it. It's
right.
sort of, and the more of that I see, I'm getting that close to watching American Horror Story. It's really, really, it's just starting to work on me now.
Yeah, seriously. That's actually, it's funny you say that. I was just there's a project that kind of came up recently, and I thought it was with that show, but it was actually another totally separate show, something like that. But that's actually one that I think I've watched the first few episodes. But yeah, definitely I don't know, there aren't any remakes yet, but maybe something that we'll talk about with it at some point. But yeah, let's dive into kind of the 1958 one, which of course has this iconic poster that it's one of those things that has turned up in various what's it called like real different strange places, like that, like if you notice, it's you'll see that kind of classic poster like just basically turn up all over the place.
And I can tell you why it's such a compelling image stroke concept is that if you look at the sort of traditional way a masculinity perceives a woman, physically large is not normally attractive. And also the idea of, at that particular time, that sort of size equates to power as well. So but also making her attractive in that is a really sort of, it's a really interesting sort of mixture that sort of played with a few different expectations, we'll say, in the 1950s.
Yeah, and ironically, this poster even shows up. It was actually an episode of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It's not so much the movie itself, but it was an episode that had that stuff. And yeah, like you said, it's just one of those things that just is a contradiction in terms. Having both something that was, this power, something like that, but also being, somewhat don't know about sexualized, but I guess at least attractive or something like that. And I think in some ways that, conveys, even though that like that scene itself of her stomping a freeway doesn't exist in the movie, it conveys, kind of the plot though of like kind of that, on one hand, she has this husband who is like, kind of a cheating, conniving, near to well, but
He's
the other,
he's a 50s Chad who's spinning plates, if we want to put it in current manosphere terms.
And also what I think another ironic part was he was a doctor from the previous movie of the Amazing Colossal Man and stuff. So right. So that's like, like what was almost like the genesis of, the this movie. And then, I guess that's played by William Hudson, and then Yvette Vickers plays the town floozy, which I guess, I don't know. And I guess we're going to get more into like kind of the ideas behind this and stuff. And probably where to start with that is just that like, the idea of a town floozy, that like you have this woman who's fallen from grace, and everyone kind of knows that, like, because there were some references in the movie where like, like he's with Honey Parker, like kind of like, like, well, that, that's obvious, right? Like, if he's going to be with anybody.
The funny, I mean, obviously she has the nickname Honey, which sort of like gives you some indication there. So different connotations, I guess, back then. Yeah. And I mean, it's sort of like, I mean, Nancy she's sort of, she's got lots of money. She's not really reliant on a man, so to speak. She could just do whatever she wants, but she has to have Harry Archer, I want to say,
right?
And I think what's interesting is this, that she's, she can have anything she wants, but she tries to go for this man who she can't really have. They've already split up once, and then she takes it's funny because she takes him back, but you later find out that the psychologist somehow persuaded her to take him back, or something along those. Like, she couldn't possibly make that decision on her own. She has to get some man to help her there, which I thought was kind of interesting. It seems kind of that everyone in town knows that he's cheating on her and is after her money. So she, apart from her sort of doting butler, she really doesn't have anyone to turn to, it seems.
Right. And it's a funny time for, we've talked about the 50s stuff that, on the one hand, the whole kind of 60s things, right, and revolutionary ideas, all that kind of stuff is around the corner, but that's not anywhere in sight yet. This is like, the kind of the suburbs is a thing, we've talked about that before, and it's this idea of like, that there is almost like this kind of golden era of television, and golden era of these kind of stereotypical role of like kind of the women being, the homemakers and stuff, and the husband being the provider. And here we have the flip side where, this ne'er-do-well is like kind of, just doesn't have any, ambition, doesn't have any kind of, isn't providing at all, something like that. And, meanwhile, the this, Nancy, she's the kind of the honeypot, and ironically, like kind of, the honey, as we've discussed, is this floozy and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost, I can't help thinking there's this sort of underlying message that if a woman has financial means by herself, then obviously there's nothing for the man to do, so may as well just go and cheat on her. That seems to be this kind of weird. And if, of course, she drinks or does anything, well, then she's clearly mad and needs to be committed, which seems to be the entire town's perspective on her, which I thought was quite funny, and that like everyone just assumes she's insane. So it's kind of, not only is it like this thing of, well, the man has nothing to do in this relationship, but also kind of like, clearly, she's crazy because she can look after herself, is almost like this kind of, you wonder if there's almost like a bit of that underneath it.
I think there's this weird like this is something we've talked a little bit about before. This weird idea in, like kind of this underlying thread in American culture that, you know, to be blue-blooded or to kind of, to inherit wealth and stuff is a bad thing and stuff because,
Right.
basically, excuse me, it creates
Yeah.
this kind of laziness and like kind of, degeneracy and,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
therefore, if you are the true, red-blooded American, you would be middle class, you would kind of, go out each day, work and what's called and consume like a good, like a good American family and stuff.
Yeah. Or you go and be even more hardworking and more successful and make billions of dollars or something. I don't know, but yeah. But yeah, and there's this sort of reoccurring theme of her diamond, the Star of India, that seems
Oh,
to be
right.
mentioned all the time, which is a sort of visual representation of her wealth. And there's a point where he steals it and shows it to sort of Honey, and I mean, it's Honey is kind of like I mean, she's kind of an interesting character in that she's fairly one-dimensional in that she just purely relies on Harry to, she's the one who's suggesting, well, why don't you just kind of bump your wife off and we'll just run away with the money. It's kind of,
Oh,
she really doesn't have sort of much more to her than that, really. Completely motivated by money, and he even kind of accepts that that's her soul. He doesn't even really, he doesn't really even seem to care that whether she really has any genuine affection for him at all. He's just like, yeah, we'll just run away. We're both sort of ne'er-do-wells who will do anything for cash. So off we go. I think it's also kind of interesting that when we do finally meet the space giant, who in turn turns her into the 50-foot woman after she finally persuades Harry that she's not mad, and they go out to the desert together. Obviously, he drops her like a bad habit as soon as this giant turns up. But it's odd that the giant would even be interested in a diamond. But
right.
I can't help thinking this is kind of a little bit of fear of immigrants sort of stuff in the, someone lands on your shores, I might steal your diamonds or something like that. There's kind of like a bit of a undercurrent of that, I think. There's also this weird thing that the giant, or this alien who looks basically just like a human with a bald head, is wearing a fleur-de-lis crest, like a French motif on his front, and a snorting bull on the back of his weird space giant tunic, which is a very surreal. Yeah,
definitely had an Ed Wood feel to it. That it was just something like kind of totally, what's called, had weird. Excuse me. Like it's really out of place and stuff.
And also when they go into the spaceship, the only thing that indicates it's a strange or alien environment is large glass balls with the police officers and the butler repeatedly putting their face up to them. So you get this sort of, funfair hall of mirrors effect a little bit, as just to keep people engaged as they walk through the spaceship.
Yeah, we're definitely like in the middle of the kind of the space era thing where, like the fascination with like rockets and going out of space and aliens and all that kind of stuff. And also like, like kind of there's some talk about like this was like a radiation effect. So it's like kind of just the mix of like kind of the atomic era fascinations just kind of thrown in there in a very hodgepodge kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder what is the motivation of the giant. I mean, he's after her diamond and scratches her neck, and she seems to be made a giant by mistake. But you can't help wondering, maybe he made her giant so that she was the same size as him.
Right.
Maybe she'll walk around and think, these guys are useless on Earth. I better go and shack up with the space giant. He seemed. If he hadn't stole my diamonds, he'd be okay. But then again, she clearly goes for bad boys, so maybe it's kind of like the right thing to do.
Yeah, it's funny that like another typical trope or thing that they typically did was having like some kind of alien kind of like talking in monotone, explaining their grand scheme and stuff like that. And but there was none of that. It was just just this like you said, coming in this medieval looking like some kind of a Renaissance festival escapee and stuff like that, and
Yeah.
and just pretty much all the stuff was kind of happening, and with no explanation. That is very atypical of some of these 50s sci-fi.
Yeah, and he's not a very he doesn't seem like a very bright space giant, because he
Right,
has
right,
the
right.
ability to travel over intergalactic distances, but someone throws a grenade at him and he's like, I'm out. This is too much for me.
Yeah.
Grenades. I didn't realize these guys had this advanced technology.
Right.
I just came for the diamonds. Time to go. So yeah, weird sort of who can really understand the space giant's motivations? But yeah, I think it's quite sort of interesting when they bring in the scientists, because we talk, it seems like Nancy is portrayed as this hysterical woman, and the scientist, and then of course she's grown to become 50 feet tall, and when they finally bring in the more sort of scientific character, his explanation to the psychologist is, well, when a woman gets to a certain age, Mother Nature overpowers her. And so it's almost like implying that, well, she's got baby rabies, and so she was crazy already, and now she's turned into a 50-foot woman. I don't know, it's hormones or something, I guess. But I think what's interesting is they contrast that. He says, hey, that's kind of like us old men admiring a 20-year-old girl. Mother Nature, it's crazy. So I thought that was some quite interesting little chat backwards and forwards there between the scientist and the psychologist.
Definitely. And another kind of interesting character I thought was the deputy Charlie there, who seems like any time that he's not basically pushed enough to do investigation and his duties, was busy dancing at the club.
That's right. Yeah, he was dancing away and playing cards with the suspects.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of more just I guess, small town police officers don't take the law seriously is kind of like the message I got from that, or something. But yeah. So yeah, I mean, so Nancy, she becomes 50 foot tall, and this new, even though the entire town is against her, nobody believes her. Now she's 50 foot tall. She can pretty much just dictate what happens to her, and she's going to go and get her man back and just crush underfoot anyone who gets in her way, basically. And the message being, of course, that as she gets electrocuted with Harry at the end, that, hey, women, you get a little too big for your boots, you're probably going to get killed, and your husband's going to suffer as well. Sorry about that.
But she ultimately did get her man, I guess.
She did. Yes, she did.
Yeah, it's just funny how it seems like kind of this weird kind of I mean, I had the impression beforehand that like we were going to see like some kind of feminist message of some kind, but of course, as we'll see with the 1993 version, we get some of that in the remake, but at the same time, it's still also not what you would expect.
No. I mean, it's funny, isn't it? It's like, I mean, there's a sort of, I guess, a sort of feminist edge to it in a way, in that, when she does become bigger, she doesn't, I mean, obviously she doesn't have to do what everyone says as much, and doesn't have to sort of listen to these men who are sort of controlling her life. But by the same token, she doesn't really seem to have any more self-control. She seems to be more out of control or less herself as a result of it, in a way. So I don't think it's a massively positive message. But
definitely.
Just my read on it, I guess. Yeah. I mean, we could move on to the 93, unless you've got anything else on the...
No, I think this is a good time to.
Okay. This one was interesting at the beginning, because it starts off with this whole kind of simulation film within a film setting, where there's people sat there watching the start of this film with being introduced by the scientist. Now, part of me was thinking, oh, this might be really clever, kind of all
Right.
meta referencing.
Right.
But I think the more cynical part of me said that, okay, we know this is going to kind of be a tongue-in-cheek humor effort here. So we're going to negate the lack of budget on the special effects by making you think this is kind of a film within a film of the 50s. So we don't have to. So it's okay. We all know what this is about from the outset. We don't have to take it too seriously. That was kind of my interpretation of it, because it does cut to Daryl Hannah driving in a really, really blatant green screen background. So
yeah,
because it didn't reoccur later on. It was not really a theme. It felt like it was just tacked on. But yeah,
and I feel like that's overall like what the movie seemed like. There were a lot of things that were kind of tacked on. I mean, it basically was a direct-to-video kind of release, stuff like that, which kind of in some ways says, well, it did get some theatrical releases overseas, like in the UK, France, Germany, stuff like that. So
I remember it. Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
In the UK, which is why I was surprised. I assumed it was a bigger movie because it got a theatrical release in the UK. But clearly not. I mean, this was also Christopher Guest from Spinal Tap's second directorial effort.
Yeah, seriously.
But I mean, compared to some of the other stuff he's done, it's not particularly funny.
No.
It's more an interesting movie than it is a funny movie, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I like would have expected more of the that kind of what's called the best of the show kind of touch, or Mighty Wind, or or like you said, Spinal Tap. I mean, but it didn't have any of that, like kind of the humor and stuff like that.
No, and I mean, if we get down to Nancy, she's quite different in this version compared to the 50s one, in that she's again sort of wealthy, but trapped in this sort of marriage that she doesn't like, much like the first one. However, this time her father is around, who isn't in the original.
Right.
And also the fact that she has this psychologist is not so much against her and trying to commit her at every stop like in the original. This one, the psychologist is more an ally as a woman and is trying to sort of back her up.
Right.
But the interesting thing for me was that Nancy in this one is much less confrontational. And you kind of feel like she doesn't actually deal with any of the issues in her life. She just tells her therapist about it. So it almost feels like the therapist is a scapegoat rather than having to deal with these things directly. Well, at least in Nancy in the original, she'd have a few drinks and then she'd shout at her husband, or get her butler to go and spy on him and stuff like this, or at least she'd sort of take a bit of responsibility. Initially, Nancy doesn't really do much, and of course the fact that her father's there, he's this kind of person who's basically doesn't think she's really shouldn't be any part of his business life and talks down to her, etc. And so
I guess I thought I'd mention that it's interesting that this is like Daryl Hannah's project after like the previous the Memoirs of the Invisible Man that we talked about, stuff like that.
Oh, really? Okay.
It was just a little bit of like kind of why we were motivated to kind of to look at these and stuff like that.
I didn't realize it was directly after, because that's probably two bad movies in a row almost.
And this is like after like one of her first breakout roles was Blade Runner and stuff. So I mean, you kind of have to wonder like and I thought she was great in that. So sometimes with stuff like this, you wonder like who's pulling the strings or who's guiding the careers of these stars, because certainly like as another gentleman we'll kind of talk about at some point discusses. Sometimes you gotta just take what you take to pay the bills and stuff. But in this case, I don't know. Like it just seemed like kind of things are kind of all over the place for her career. Things did kind of eventually stabilize a little bit, or But I think it's interesting that it seemed like her career just has always been just pulled all over the place and stuff like that. That's just my general impression.
I mean, I think, to be honest with you, if you saw the script for this, you'd probably, and you realize that sort of pretty much every scene has kind of some every scene has a sub theme. There's always kind of like a different layer to it. You would have, I mean, it's quite an interesting kind of take on it, but unfortunately, I don't think it tried to be, by trying to pull something that's not relevant to the times and make it relevant, but then not really be funny or not really be sort of, it's a bit too, it's not really enough of any one thing really. I think is the problem. But I can understand that her going in and reading the script for this must have thought, oh, this is a pretty interesting project, because I think there is some definite interesting twists. I mean, she goes from this very meek, coy, non-confrontational woman to, when she does get made larger, her actually, unlike the original, she actually has a total character change, which is quite interesting,
right?
And I mean, of course, we've got Daniel Baldwin. I wasn't even aware there was another Baldwin brother. I mean,
there's quite a few of those.
Yeah. I mean, he's there as the sort of manipulative husband.
Right.
But again, he's quite different from the original as well. In that, Harry in the original was, he would just be he made no apologies for his behavior.
Right.
He was just like, yeah, well, I'm seeing this other woman because you're crazy and drunk, and but maybe we can patch it up or something. Whereas this one, he's very much more manipulative. He has one personality that he talks to her with, and then a different personality that he talks to other people with, it seems. So he's, a little bit. And I mean, it's a pretty good performance, really, I think. Likewise with Daryl Hannah when she makes that transition as well.
I think we should mention also like the psychiatrist and therapist is Frances Fisher, who we saw as Jane Crawford, Judd's wife in Watchmen.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. She did. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing. It's hard to necessarily fault any one person for this movie, because everyone sort of does a pretty decent job with it, I think. But,
in this case, the sheriff and deputy, like, they have a little bit more dialogue and stuff like that, but it kind of goes in kind of bizarre directions as well. In this case, like, the deputy kind of seems pretty by the way, it had a sex change, so it's Charlie is now a female. I guess it's short for Charlotte, and she seems kind of even more not so bright for most of the movie. But then towards the middle, she has a relatively long kind of dialogue with the sheriff about love and like kind of meaning of life.
Yeah, that was quite interesting, actually, the whole Out of Luck Eddie story, in that basically how you can interpret his story is that he's saying that we carry on, because basically the younger female cop says, oh, people don't, accept me as a female cop, and my mother doesn't think it's a very womanly thing to do, but, she'll carry on doing it, whatever, because she enjoys it. And then she's just like, I can't understand why Mrs. Archer hangs around with Harry, he's such an asshole, basically. So he basically explains this very long-winded story of Out of Luck Eddie, who's this guy who goes around in the mountains trying to look for gold that doesn't exist. So he says we carry on with dysfunctional behavior because we have to justify the time and effort that we waste doing it to ourselves, even though we know it's bad for us. So, if you show that you're defeated, then it's kind of like saying, well, I've definitely wasted all this time. And it's a sort of an analogy for the relationship that Mrs. Archer has rather than some guy up in the hills. But, it says by holding on to hope, you even though it doesn't have any common sense grounding, that's right. Why we carry on in these behaviors, which was quite interesting, because she does try, even when she becomes 50 foot tall, she starts telling her dad to sod off when he's getting her to sign these papers. Right. There's lots of paper signing, which I assume his wife or the mother put in place so that he doesn't spend all the money. That's kind of what you get from this, in that the father is much like Harry in the original, in that he's just kind of spending money on business ventures that go wrong. Yeah. So he's put this thing in where the daughter has to sign, hoping that that her daughter will at some point come to her senses and stop him from doing this, which she does when she becomes 50 foot. And then she starts sort of questioning Harry and various other, pretty much everyone who's sort of trying to control her, essentially.
Right.
So we have a much more kind of transcendental transformation in this one when she becomes 50 foot, in that it really is an analogy for growth as a person, because she's sort of, you know, taking more responsibility, challenging people on, and not letting people walk all over her effectively. Unlike her mother, who I should mention committed suicide in the 1993 version because of this overbearing husband who made her miserable.
Right. Yeah, I think that was an interesting kind of point about it, that like the transformation is not just physical, but also her psychological, you know, and outlook on things. And it does seem like kind of, you know, like very much the relationship changes, you know, between Nancy and the different, you know, men in her life, you know, like kind of, you know, like this, you know, basically not only is she kind of pushing back on them, but also like she talks about basically, you know, kind of taking Harry, kind of, you know, and I guess this is something that was probably maybe provocative even for the 90s and stuff, but talking about like kind of, you know, they kind of hinted at it and get into a graphic discussion about like kind of this sexual possibilities and stuff, but
yeah. I mean, she's like, she says, oh, you know, I'm like a new person. This is new dimensions, new adventures, and everything else.
Right.
And she says, I can take you with me. We can go this, and this is this kind of thing. It's an analogy for empowered women who are now in the workplace and taking more control of their lives. You know,
right.
They're making this argument. This is a new adventure. And of course, his look, and he's staring up at this sort of far more physically large woman in absolute disgust, because this goes totally against his sort of model of conventional, I guess, visual beauty and everything else. And the fact that she's now no longer sort of beholden to him, and in pure disgust calls her a freak and tells her to, you know, go away, and then you know, completely sort of demeans her and says that, oh, the other woman's far better.
I was going to say,
yeah.
But not only now, but also than she ever was. So, which is interesting, because then that also implies that like when she was passive and stuff, that was also not, you know, what he found desirable. Everything.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it, actually? Because there's obviously it's very difficult to pin down exactly what kind of character, if you even take the size thing out of it, you know, it's very hard to pin down exactly what Harry wants out of a woman, really.
Because now that she's powerful, you know, like, oh, that's a turn off. But then before, when she was passive, that was also a turn off and stuff. So it was like, you know, so what is it then?
Yeah, just another woman, I guess, is what you can boil it down to. So I mean, that was kind of interesting. I think as well with there's a lot of mention of stress, and stress can give you a heart attack. True. And this is kind of, I guess, in this period of time, I guess late 80s, early 90s, where you definitely there was just this sort of thing of going to a therapist, and you wouldn't maybe actually try and sort of do behavior change. It's just like, oh, you're stressed, so go and talk to someone about it. But stress was never really, it was just kind of like a catch-all for any kind of problem. It's not really stress, it's the fact that her husband's cheating on her, you know. that's it's not stress per se. And that her, you know, her dad's sort of a bit of a bastard to her as well. But it's just interesting, there was lots of things floating around at that time that was just like, it was just a convenient kind of reason to not take responsibility for things, I think.
But you know, like you said, I think it became more in vogue, and like kind of, you know, like, whereas that was something probably in even as late as the 80s was kind of taken as like you know, taboo a little bit, of like, you know, admitting that you go to see a psychiatrist or therapist and stuff. Whereas, you know, by this point now, it started becoming more like, you know, like almost like a badge of, you know, courage or honor, that like, oh, you know, like, kind of, you know, we're in couple therapy now, or I'm seeing a therapist, and like kind of it's like you're not quite get out of jail card, but a card of like kind of waving around that like, oh, hey, I'm more enlightened and stuff, or I'm, you know, doing things to improve myself.
Yeah, it's funny. It's one of those things. I think it's somewhat like you said. I think it's kind of, I'm trying to improve myself, but it's also a way of I can't really control myself, so don't be surprised if I don't take any accountability for my bad actions. I've got a problem. I need to go to a therapist. It's also a badge of privilege as well. It's like not many people can afford to go and see a therapist on a regular basis. So hence why, there's plenty of them in Hollywood, I guess, where people have lots of money to go and explore this kind of stuff.
That's true.
I also thought what was interesting, the romantic scene where she talks about Gulliver's Travels was really interesting, so there was a subtle, I mean, okay, overall this is about sort of empowered women, but there's this sort of weird subtle subtext because she starts to describe things around her, and we can infer people as toys in a way. So there's this sort of subtle thing that, okay, there's still a bit of a sort of 1950s mentality in a way, in that if you're really wealthy and you're really empowered as a woman, well, you might start toying with people as well. That was kind of like the slightly subtle message I got from there.
And she did have this thing about dollhouses, here's this kind of grown woman, and she had this fascination with dollhouses, and I think she even kind of says at one point that now the world is my dollhouse and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you have to sort of infer that was the father sort of treating her like a child too much and not putting her in a sort of adult position that made her that way. I mean, I guess that's maybe okay, she is passive, but maybe she's too much like a child. Maybe she hasn't lived enough. So which is why Harry can't sort of relate to her perhaps. But yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental bit of that whole scene with her trying to take charge of the romantic dinner, which obviously doesn't appeal to Harry either, is that, basically this is more of a sort of fundamental thing on men and women anyway, and that women do tend to change over time and men less so, which is exactly what happens here. Is like Harry is completely unwilling to try out life with a 50-foot woman, as it would be a bit of a stretch.
Should we spoil it a bit?
Absolutely, yeah. That's what we do.
So I think it's interesting that then the resolution is that he sent into this kind of group therapy situation unlike of course the original where both the couple was destroyed and stuff like that, dying each other's arms. Here, there's sent off into space where Nancy finds her peers of other giant women and stuff, and then meanwhile, Harry is kind of now with these other men who are basically made to work out or try to learn from the mistakes as to kind of how to be a better husband and stuff.
Yeah, I thought that was actually a really interesting. It's funny. It seems like a very kind of half-hearted attempt at some sort of comedy in the ending, but I think it's quite an interesting sort of comment on what we see now with the whole sort of manosphere thing, in that people feel like these 50-foot women are controlling them, and they have to kind of behave in certain ways that are politically correct in order to sort of do this. So that was a really quite surprising ending for this movie, I thought. I also thought it was quite interesting that when she does go sort of full Titan on the rampage, she says, I tried being modern and post-feminist and where it got me,
Right.
Cause chaos. I also thought the way the dysfunctional men are portrayed very clearly, in that there's Harry, who's only after women, and there's the dad who's basically just after success and reputation. There's the two sort of archetypes of I guess you could say toxic masculine men or something like this, the way that's portrayed in this anyway. I think the subtext of them calling in the National Guard is sort of like society doesn't like dealing with powerful women, perhaps. You could say something like that, maybe. And even the pilot, every line almost seems to be loaded with some kind of subtext, because he's like, when he says, should I really shoot a ground to air missile at a woman? I don't think I should do that. And he goes, and the other pilot says, just think of a target. That's what I always do. It's kind of.
And I could tell you that, compared to a a movie has a military consultant, stuff like that, that like they would have like said, this is not stuff that you would never hear in a cockpit, and
No.
and there'd just be no way that any of these lines would be said and stuff.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. I mean, the fact that this is, I guess, sort of Christopher Guest, it comes across as quite sort of pro-feminist, but there's sort of subtle sort of jabs all the way through that, it might be, a bit over the top. But unfortunately, with all these kind of interesting subtext and sub things, there doesn't actually seem to be very many laughs in this movie. It doesn't really.
That's the thing, yeah.
It's just not very funny at all, really.
I mean, you can have all these kind of, ideas and points and all that kind of stuff, be kind of quote unquote more thoughtful, but in the end of the day, if it's not entertaining, then it's all lost.
Yeah, and this is one of those things where it's kind of, I think Spinal Tap was obviously so funny and was probably hugely successful that probably someone just like greenlit this project anyway, thinking, this guy knows comedy. And it sort of takes me back to watching, I think, some interviews with Judd Apatow where he would write essentially two versions of a script, test them, and then see how audiences responded, and then use the better of them, and then again change it again and do two versions. See how, and just doing things like that. It was you got to get sort of unbiased feedback to see whether these things. It sounds very clever, but it's just not. Shows you've got to get the real laughs in order to make a successful comedy.
At the same time, I think you got to get the studio backing you to kind of support that and stuff, and then because that's not cheap, I'm sure, and also like where there's the time element and stuff like that. But it doesn't seem like like any of that went to this one. It seemed like they just kind of wanted to get it out there and done and stuff.
Yeah. And so the movies, I'm trying to think, do they actually go back? And then they have this sort of weird thing where all of the female characters did really well in the sort of there's little credits that roll up and say, okay, the psychologist went on to become like a Nobel Prize winner, and the cop went on to become an FBI, and the floozy, we didn't really talk about the town floozy in this one, Honey Parker, who's actually very different in that in this one she's portrayed as someone who's just trying to change her situation and is trying to study law and do various other things, but seems to just get involved with men, and also the father, which is interesting. You get the impression she was he paid for her nose job and kind of was seeing her for a bit, and now she's with Harry, but and then we have, rather than her being sort of crushed by the 50-foot woman, she sort of gives her an empowering speech saying how she's better than all this, and you can do it and just forget about these men. Which I thought was quite an interesting change. And I suppose the fact that in a way she sort of helps Nancy at one stage as well when she's just been abducted by the alien. But I would say the unfortunate thing about this that really let it down for me, there was no medieval tunic sporting space giant in this. We didn't see any of that. There was no diamond theft or anything, so that was a bit disappointing that we didn't get to see that. Some modern interpretation of it. Though I guess we did see some 50-foot alien females at the end. I also noticed the logo of the aliens was a kind of a slightly not unsymmetrical triangle, but obviously feminism triangle symbol is clearly not very far away from that. But
I did catch like kind of one cameo, something like that, was with Xander Berkeley as like one of the men in the kind of the scenes and stuff like that, who we'll talk about pretty quickly in Candyman as the husband and stuff like that. So
yes, indeed, when we get to see the new Jordan Peele version. Speaking of which, I guess what's next on our roster of movies?
Definitely we'll see when we can get to watch both versions of Candyman. I'm really looking forward to that. So certainly we've talked about kind of revisiting the Universal Monsters and stuff. So I think that would be kind of an enjoyable project. I've been watching horror noir, which makes me, like, when we talk about Dracula at some point, I definitely want to talk about Blackula, not as a remake of Dracula, but it's a it's an interesting movie. Like I knew there was something about it, just even as a kid watching it, that like kind of struck me about it. And then now, like kind of watching kind of perspective of horror noir and the discussions, it's kind of like, you know, definitely even more profound, I guess, in some ways, because it was apparently the first horror directed by a black, you know, director or stuff like that.
Mhm.
And you know, and it's had, you know, mostly, you know, of course, black cast and everything, which, you know, in itself, that's in itself isn't, you know, a huge change and stuff like that. But yeah, so it's just kind of one of those things. And I guess some of the monsters that we've talked about or will talk about at some point, or, you know, besides Dracula, is of course Frankenstein, and we've already talked about the Invisible Man, and then the Mummy, which kind of I guess that's another one that is controversial in the sense of like it didn't do as well in the box office with the most recent remake. So that'll be an interesting discussion about kind of the future of this Universal Monsterverse, I guess.
I guess these will all be done just in time for Halloween.
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
So yeah, once again, John Chang with Dan Evans, and thanks for watching, and we will see you at the movies.